As the war in West Asia enters its 8th day, a quiet diplomatic effort is unfolding behind the scenes. Saudi Arabia has reportedly intensified direct communication with Iran. According to Bloomberg, Riyadh is opening urgent channels with Tehran in an attempt to prevent the conflict from spiraling. Riyadh, which has long been a regional rival of Tehran, finds itself directly exposed to the fallout of the conflict. Iranian drones and missiles have targeted Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia, raising fears that the war could engulf the entire region and threaten global energy supplies. Saudi Aramco's Ras Tanura, which houses its largest domestic refinery and a key crude export terminal, had come under attack. It was targeted by an attempted drone attack on Wednesday, and now, interestingly, Tehran denied any role in the attack. But for the kingdom, the fear is real. Faced with that risk, Saudi leaders have reportedly stepped up contacts with Iranian officials, hoping to de-escalate tensions and prevent further attacks across the Gulf. The diplomatic outreach reflects growing concern among Gulf states that the conflict between Iran, Israel, and the United States could cause more damage in the region. Again, Tehran acknowledges that mediation efforts are underway, but it hasn't specifically mentioned that which nations or which mediators it is talking to. Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian said several countries have begun trying to broker peace, and he asserted that Iran supports lasting peace but will defend its sovereignty, adding that mediation must address those who ignited this conflict. For Saudi Arabia, the calculation is simple, as the war may not be theirs, but the consequences certainly are. As missiles fly across West Asia, Riyadh is trying to keep diplomacy alive, even if it means talking directly to its fiercest rival. For more on this, joining us live from London is Greg Swenson. He is an international affairs expert. Greg, Saudi Arabia has reportedly been pushing for greater diplomatic communication between the parties involved in the conflict, warning that further escalation could destabilize the wider region. Can Riyadh's push for dialogue at this stage bring about mediation?
Well, it's a great question. I think dialogue is always helpful, and I think there's no risk or downside for having conversations or discussions. And if the Saudis can mediate some sort of conversation or discussion between the U.S. and Iran, great. But I think at this point, Iran is practically defeated. They're the overwhelming, I'll call it asymmetric advantage that the U.S. and Israel have over Iran is something that we did not expect. I thought this would be a little bit more competitive in a way, and yet, the Iranians or the regime will fire missiles randomly, but they're firing a lot fewer missiles now than they were 4 days ago, and so I'm not sure that there's any discussion to be had except unconditional surrender.
Greg, the U.S. Army says more than 3,000 targets hit Iran this week, and the U.S. military's Central Command also claims that it has destroyed 43 Iranian warships since it launched the war. With the White House saying that the U.S. is well on its way to controlling Iranian airspace and expecting its objectives to be completed within 4 to 6 weeks, what does this mean for West Asia region as a whole, and what does gaining control of a country's airspace actually entail in simple terms?
Yeah, no, it's another great question. And look, it's uncomfortable for the countries in the region because they have missiles being fired at them, and I don't want to underestimate, or I don't want to suggest that that's not unpleasant. However, the entire region is now on board with the U.S. and with Israel. I think the only option for Iran, or specifically for the regime, is to surrender unconditionally. But I'm afraid that would be unfair to the Iranian people. So we, meaning the U.S. and Israel and the other allies in the region, Saudi Arabia, UAE, et cetera, they can eliminate the nuclear capabilities of Iran. They can eliminate the ballistic missiles. They can eliminate the Navy, which the U.S. has practically done already. And they can also eliminate the funding of the proxies. So these were the terrorist proxies. These were all the goals of the U.S. during the negotiations, which the regime refused to negotiate on. So at this point, even if we had all of those concessions from the regime, you still have to worry about the people of Iran who have to live in the regime and be controlled by the mullahs. Only less than 15% of Iranians actually support the regime or the mullahs. So I'm not sure at this point there's any turning back. It would be, I would argue, unjust for the people of Iran if we started negotiating on terms now that could have been negotiated peacefully 2 weeks ago or even a week ago. So, it's still early in the process. We all would prefer a peaceful negotiation or a peaceful off-ramp, but at this point, we are thinking about the people of Iran as well.
Craig, you highlighted the aspect of peace, but if we touch upon the topic of civilian targeting and international law, the United Nations has called for an urgent investigation after missiles struck a girls' school in Minab in southern Iran, killing 165 people, most of them girls between 7 and 12 years old. They warn the attack raises the most serious concerns under international law. So how grave is an allegation like this, and what kind of thresholds would investigators look at to determine whether this constitutes a potential war crime?
Well, no, I can guarantee you there's no war crime involved. This is, if there was a mistake, then there should be some consequences for that mistake. And I don't want to underestimate that. However, it's clear that the Americans and the Israelis do not target civilians. And you've seen in the last week, the regime quite deliberately targets civilians. So it's apples and oranges. There is no risk that there'll be any sort of outcome from this investigation. Again, if mistakes were made, partly because the regime uses the schools and civilians as human shields, and that's really criminal in itself. But if there was a mistake made, then there should be consequences. I'm not arguing against that. However, it's pretty clear from the last week and from the last few decades, actually, that the regime targets civilians just like their terrorist proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis target civilians. The Americans do not. We are liberators, not occupiers. There's no way we would target a school. It's absolutely impossible.